My dad died on a Tuesday. I didn't find out until Wednesday morning because my stepbrother Shane had turned off my phone's emergency alerts somehow. I still don't fully understand how he did it, and by the time my neighbor knocked on my door at 7 a.m., holding a newspaper with that look on her face, it had already been 18 hours. 18 hours that Shane had spent alone in my father's house, with my father's safe, with my father's filing cabinets. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand who my dad was before I tell you what they did to him. My dad, Robert, built his landscaping company from literally nothing. I mean that. He started with a second-hand truck, a broken mower he fixed with YouTube tutorials, and a route of 12 houses in our suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. By the time I was in high school, he had 40 employees, 3 trucks, and contracts with 2 of the largest commercial properties in the county. He used to joke that he was just a guy who liked being outside and figured out how to get paid for it. He met Gloria when I was 19. I was away at Ohio State, so I only saw her during holidays at first. She was polished in a way my dad never was, always in silk blouses, always with the right thing to say. She had a son, Shane, who was 23 when they married. Shane had that particular kind of charm that reads as confidence until you're close enough to see it's actually contempt. I tried. I really did. I hosted Shane at my apartment for a football game once. I included Gloria in our family Christmas photo. I bit my tongue through 100 dinners where Shane talked over me, and Gloria smiled like she was performing the role of supportive stepmother in a movie no one had asked for. My dad was happy, or seemed to be. That was enough for me then. I got engaged to Marcus when I was 27, a good man, an honest man. We were trying for a baby, quietly, just between us and one fertility specialist in Dublin, Ohio named Dr. Ewan. I'd had one loss the year before, early 8 weeks, but still. It hollowed me out in a way I hadn't expected. We kept trying. I'm telling you this because you need to understand how distracted I was, how much of my attention was somewhere else, how easy it was for things to shift at my father's company without me noticing. Dad called me in March, about 2 years into his marriage to Gloria. He said he'd been feeling tired. I told him to sleep more. He said his numbers at the doctor were a little off. I told him to drink more water. I was the worst kind of busy, the kind where you hear words but don't actually listen. His numbers got worse. He lost 12 pounds in 4 months without trying. His doctor put him on a cardiac medication called digoxin. It helps regulate heart rhythm, and for a while he seemed stable. Then he started having episodes, dizzy spells, confusion in the evenings. I flew home in October. Marcus came with me. The moment I walked into my dad's house, I felt something wrong in the air. The kind of wrong you can't name, you just feel it in your chest. Shane was there, sitting at my dad's kitchen table with a laptop open, papers spread in front of him like he owned the place. Gloria was making tea. "He's resting," Shane said before I could even ask. "He had a rough night. I'd like to see him," I said. "Let him sleep, Bridget." That was the first time I felt it clearly. Shane was managing access to my own father. I went upstairs anyway. Dad looked smaller. That's the only word for it. He'd always been a big, square-shouldered man, the kind who fixed things with his hands and never complained. In that bed, he looked like he'd been folded down to a smaller version of himself. He squeezed my hand and smiled and said, "You worry too much, sweetheart." I almost believed him. I went back downstairs and asked Gloria directly how long he'd been this bad. She said on and off for a few months without quite meeting my eyes. I asked to see the medication list. Shane cut in and said the doctors had everything under control. I didn't push. I should have pushed. I flew home 2 days later and told myself I'd come back at Christmas. He died before Christmas. The week after my neighbor knocked on my door, I drove back to Columbus in a kind of fog. The funeral was a blur of casseroles and handshakes and people telling me my dad was the best man they'd ever done business with, which was true and also made me want to sit down on the floor and not get up. What shook me back to consciousness was the will reading. My dad's attorney, a quiet man named Mr. Howell, who'd handled my dad's business affairs for 15 years, called me the morning after the funeral. He said there was a problem. He said the will on file, the one my father had signed 6 years ago, which left the business and the house to me with a generous provision for Gloria, had apparently been superseded by a new document signed 8 months ago. In the new document, the business went to Shane, the house went to Gloria. I received my mother's jewelry and a savings account with about $14,000 in it. I sat in my car in a parking garage and stared at the dashboard for a long time. Then I called Mr. Howe back and asked him to send me a copy of the new will. I'm going to tell you what I noticed. The signature was my dad's. The notary stamp was real. But the date was March 15th, 3 days after my dad had his first serious dizzy spell, the one where Gloria had taken him to the ER and he'd been sent home with an adjusted medication dose. 3 days after my father could barely stand up, he had supposedly driven to an attorney's office and rewritten his entire estate plan. I called my dad's oldest employee, a man named Frank who'd been with the company for 11 years. I asked Frank how things were at the business. He went quiet for a moment, then said, "Bridget, I've been waiting for you to call." Frank told me things that made my hands shake. Over the past 18 months, Shane had inserted himself into the business under the pretense of helping my increasingly unwell father. He'd convinced my dad to give him signatory authority on the business accounts. He'd started redirecting certain client payments, not all of them, just enough to obscure, into a separate LLC he'd created with a nearly identical name to my dad's company. Capital R Landscaping versus Capital R Landscaping Services LLC. If you weren't looking carefully, the names were nearly identical on a bank statement. Frank had noticed. He'd raised it with my dad once, gently, and my dad had gotten confused, genuinely confused, not dismissive, and said he thought Shane had explained it to him, but he couldn't quite remember the explanation. That confusion, that was the thing that unraveled everything, eventually. I hung up with Frank and called Marcus. I told him what I was looking at. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Bridget, what was his digoxin level when he died?" Marcus is a pharmacist. I hadn't thought to ask him until that moment. Digoxin is a marrow-therapeutic index drug. That's the technical term. What it means in plain English is that the difference between a therapeutic dose and a toxic dose is very small. Too much digoxin causes the exact symptoms my father had in his final months: extreme fatigue, confusion, cardiac episodes, weight loss, and digoxin toxicity can be detected in blood work, but only if someone thinks to look for it. I called the hospital where my dad had been treated. I asked about his most recent labs. I was told they couldn't release information to me directly, which I understood. I wasn't his medical proxy because in the new documents Gloria had been named as such, but the attending physician, when I explained my concern in very careful terms, told me off the record that my father's digoxin levels had been, and I'm quoting, "notably elevated at his last admission," but that they had attributed it to medication non-compliance, meaning they assumed he'd accidentally taken too much himself. Nobody had ordered a tox screen. Nobody had thought to look further. I went back to Columbus with a plan. Gloria didn't know I was coming. I showed up at the house on a Thursday morning, let myself in with the key my dad had given me years ago. Gloria hadn't changed the locks yet, and I sat in my dad's home office for 4 hours. My dad was old-fashioned about one thing: paper. He printed everything: bank statements, contracts, vendor invoices, all of it in labeled manila folders in a fireproof cabinet that he'd shown me the combination to when I turned 21. Shane had clearly been through the cabinet. Folders were out of order, some missing. But he hadn't found what I was looking for because he hadn't known it existed. Behind the bottom drawer, taped to the back panel, was a manila envelope my dad had put there some time in the past year. On the front, he had written one word in his handwriting: Bridget. Inside was a letter. I'm not going to quote it exactly because it's mine, and because I read it about 40 times in the days after, and I'm not ready to share all of it. But I will tell you what it said in broad terms. My dad had figured it out. Not all of it, not the LLC or the extent of the financial theft, but the medication. He'd done his own research. My dad, who said technology would be the end of us, had looked up digoxin toxicity on his phone, and he had begun to suspect that someone was adjusting his doses. He said he thought it had started small, that maybe he was imagining it, But he wrote that he'd noticed his symptoms were worse on days when Shane had been the one to bring him his medications, and better on days when he'd taken them himself from the bottle. He said he hadn't gone to the police because he was afraid of what Shane would do if he found out my dad suspected him. He said Gloria had made comments, subtle ones, about what would happen to me if my dad made trouble. He was protecting me the only way he knew how, which was to try to stay alive long enough to figure out another way. He didn't make it. At the end of the letter, he said, "The company is yours. I never changed the will. Whatever you find that says differently is not from me. Fight for it." I photographed every page of the letter on my phone. Then I put it back in the envelope and taped it exactly where it had been. I didn't want anyone to know I'd found it yet. I called a probate attorney that afternoon, a woman named Ms. Chen, who specializes in contested estates and who had the kind of calm, precise delivery that made me feel, for the first time in weeks, like I wasn't completely alone in this. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Tell me more about the medication." Over the next 3 weeks, we built a case the way you build anything solid, carefully, one piece at a time. Ms. Chen filed a formal challenge to the will, citing concerns about testamentary capacity given my dad's documented medical decline at the time of signing. That bought us time and forced the new will into probate court rather than automatic execution. I hired a forensic accountant, a methodical woman named Dr. Reyes, who went through 18 months of business records and found what Frank had started to see. Approximately $340,000 had been moved out of my dad's business accounts through the Shell LLC. Some of it was direct transfers. Some of it was inflated vendor invoices from companies that, when you looked them up, had the same registered agent as Shane's LLC. He'd been doing this for almost 2 years. The will itself was the other piece. Miss Dowie? Chen connected us with a forensic document examiner who looked at the signature, the paper, the notary stamp. The notary, when she was contacted by investigators, said she had no memory of the signing, which was unusual enough that it prompted a more formal inquiry. Shane had apparently used a mobile notary service, and the paperwork was, to put it carefully, incomplete in ways that a legitimate transaction typically isn't. The medical examiner's office agreed to a review of my dad's case after Miss Precht. Chen submitted the letter, the medication concerns, and the circumstantial pattern. It took 11 weeks. I checked my phone every morning expecting a call, and every night went to sleep having not gotten one. On a Wednesday in February, I got the call. Elevated digoxin levels confirmed, post-mortem. Pattern consistent with chronic low-level administration above prescribed dosage. Combined with my dad's underlying cardiac condition, it had been enough. The investigators moved from there. They executed a search warrant on the house the following Friday. Gloria called me that afternoon, shrieking into the phone that I was destroying the family, that my dad would be ashamed of me, that she had done nothing wrong. I listened to about 45 seconds of it, and then I hung up. Shane was arrested 8 days later. Gloria was charged as an accessory. The investigators found communications between her and Shane on a shared tablet that had been, ironically, backed up to a cloud account that Shane had set up using my dad's email address and therefore was accessible to the estate. In those messages, they discussed the will. They discussed the medication. At one point, Gloria had written, "If he's confused enough to sign, that's all we need." She was confused enough to write it in a text message. I want to pause here and tell you about the people who showed up during this period, because I think you need to know that too. Frank, my dad's employee, never wavered. He testified to everything he'd seen, even when Shane's attorney implied he had a financial motive to lie. He didn't. He was 61 years old and had worked for my dad for 11 years because he said my dad had hired him when no one else would, and he wasn't going to let that go unanswered. My next-door neighbor from the Columbus house, a 74-year-old woman named Mrs. Kowalski, who had known my dad since I was in middle school, went down to the courthouse on the day of the preliminary hearing just to sit in the gallery. She told me afterward, "I wasn't going to let you be alone in a room where those people were." I still tear up thinking about that. And Marcus, who drove back and forth to Columbus with me more times than I can count, who listened to me go through the same details over and over at midnight, who made coffee at 5 a.m. when I couldn't sleep, who said once, very quietly, "Your dad knew you would find the letter. He left it for you because he knew." The civil portion of the estate case resolved in the spring. The fraudulent will was vacated. The estate, the business, the house, my dad's accounts came back to me. Dr. Sett Reyes's forensic work helped the DA calculate restitution as part of Shane's criminal plea. He pled guilty to financial elder abuse, fraud, and one count related to the medication. The criminal charge for that was complicated, they told me, because proving intent in medication cases is genuinely difficult, even with the text messages. But between the fraud charges and everything else, Shane received 7 years. Gloria took a plea as well, 3 years, plus restitution. I sold the business. I thought about keeping it. Frank would have run it with me, but every time I walked through those offices, I thought about Shane sitting at my dad's kitchen table with his laptop like he already owned it, and I couldn't make myself stay. I sold it to a regional landscaping company that agreed to retain all existing employees. Frank got a very good severance package. He cried a little when I told him. I cried a lot. I kept the house. I repainted it. I pulled out the sad, neglected planters in the front. Shane had let them die, which felt almost like a deliberate insult given what the business was, and I replanted them with the same things my dad always grew: purple coneflower, black-eyed Susans, whatever was stubborn enough to come back every year without much fuss. I have a daughter now, 8 months old. We named her Rose. Marcus cried when she was born. This big, steady man who had held everything together for a year just completely came apart in the best way, right there in the delivery room. She has my dad's eyes, I think. That same steady brown that always looked like it was thinking about something. I talked to her about my dad. I know she can't understand yet. I tell her anyway. I tell her about the truck and the mower and the 12-house route and how he built something from nothing because he loved being outside and figured out how to get paid for it. I tell her that her grandfather was the kind of man who, even when he was sick and scared, thought first about protecting his daughter. I put the letter in a safe deposit box. I want Rose to read it someday. I want her to know who he was. I don't think about Shane and Gloria much. I did for a long time. I'd be lying if I said I didn't. There were months where I was furious in a way that felt like it would never drain out of me. But there's something about replanting those coneflowers in the spring, something about getting your hands in the same dirt your father tended, that moves things along. Doesn't fix it. Doesn't make it make sense. Just moves it. My dad used to say, "The plants don't know if you're having a bad day. They just need water and light." I think about that a lot. I try to do the same. People ask me sometimes if I'm angry, and I have to sit with that for a second before I answer, because the honest answer is, yes, I was. For a long time, I was the kind of angry that sits in your chest like something too heavy to carry and too heavy to put down. But here's what I've come to understand about Shane and Gloria, and what happened to my father, and what happened to me in the months after. They didn't fail because they were unlucky. They failed because of the specific choices they made, repeated over months and years, each one building on the last. Shane chose to take a little, then more. Gloria chose to look away, then to participate. They chose to believe that greed could be managed, that paper trails could be erased, that a sick man's confusion was their opportunity. Every single one of those choices had a cost. The cost just came due later than they expected. That's not luck. That's not fate. That's just how choices work when you follow them all the way to their end. My dad made choices too. He chose to write that letter. He chose to hide it somewhere he knew I'd look, in a cabinet whose combination he'd shared with me on my 21st birthday because he said, "You should always know where the important things are." He chose to trust me with the truth even when he couldn't say it out loud. That choice, quiet, private, made by a sick man in a house that wasn't fully his anymore, is what ultimately undid everything Shane and Gloria had built. One letter, placed by one man who knew his daughter well enough to believe she'd fight. I think about that a lot when I feel like the careful thing and the right thing are pulling in opposite directions. My dad didn't have the strength to go to the police. He didn't have the resources to call an attorney. What he had was clarity about who I was and enough presence of mind to leave a trail. That's a kind of intelligence that doesn't get talked about much. The intelligence of knowing what you actually have and using exactly that, nothing more, nothing less. And then there's the matter of Frank, of Mrs. Kowalski, of Marcus driving back and forth to Columbus with me at midnight. None of them were obligated to show up the way they did. They did it because of who my dad was, because of the kind of man he'd been over 11 years of early mornings and honest work and hiring someone when no one else would. The goodness he'd put into the world didn't disappear when he died. It came back through the people he'd treated well, exactly when I needed it most. I'm not saying good people never get hurt. My dad got hurt. Badly. Fatally. The world isn't clean like that. But I do think that what you build in your life, the relationships, the honesty, the way you treat the person who's been with you 11 years, those things have weight. They hold up under pressure in ways that fear and greed never do. Rose is 8 months old now. She won't remember any of this. She'll grow up in a house with replanted coneflowers and a grandfather she knows only through photographs and the stories I tell her. I'm going to tell her all of it, eventually. The whole thing. Not because I want her to be afraid of the world, but because I want her to understand that integrity isn't just a word people say at graduations. It's a decision you make when it costs you something. My dad made it. It cost him everything. And it still mattered. That's what I want her to carry.